it for the first time, and this time it was McEwen.
In 1960, Chrysler engineers unveiled an engine that most people ignored. It wasn't flashy. It didn't have 8 cylinders. It didn't rumble like a muscle car or promise quarter-mile glory. It was a 6-cylinder, and in an era obsessed with cubic inches and horsepower, that practically made it invisible. But here's the thing. While those V8s were blowing head gaskets and cracking blocks, this little 6-cylinder was quietly racking up 300,000 miles, 400,000. Some owners claimed 500,000. This is the story of the Chrysler 225 Slant Six and how it outsmarted every V8 engine of its generation through nothing more than balanced engineering. Along the way, we'll encounter corporate politics, brilliant design choices, and an engine that refused to die no matter what its owners did to it. So let's begin. But first, why did Chrysler build a slanted engine in the first place? To understand the Slant Six, you have to understand what Chrysler was dealing with in the late 1950s. The company was hemorrhaging money. They'd gotten fat during the post-war boom, built massive cars with massive engines, and suddenly found themselves watching compact imports eat into their market share. Volkswagen Beetles were everywhere. Renaults were showing up. Even American Motors was cleaning up with the Rambler. The average American family, it turned out, didn't always need a land yacht that got 8 miles to the gallon. So Chrysler did something they hadn't done in years. They started from scratch. The project was called the A-Body, and it would become the Valiant. But the car was only half the story. They needed an engine, something new, something efficient, something that could compete with those foreign imports on economy while still feeling like an American car. The man they put in charge was Willem Weertman. Now, Weertman was a Dutch-born engineer who'd been with Chrysler since the late 40s, and he had a reputation for doing things his own way. When the executives told him to design a cheap, simple 6-cylinder, he came back with something nobody expected, an engine tilted 30 degrees to the right. Why 30 degrees? Think about it. By tilting the engine, Weertman lowered its overall height. That meant a lower hood line, a lower center of gravity, better weight distribution. It also meant the carburetor could sit higher, giving better fuel mixture flow into the cylinders. The intake and exhaust manifolds could be positioned more efficiently. Everything about the engine benefited from that 30-degree angle. But there was another reason, and this is where Weertman's genius really shows. By slanting the engine, he could use a longer intake manifold. Now, I know that sounds like a minor detail, but it's actually crucial. A longer intake manifold means the air-fuel mixture has more time to atomize, more time to mix properly before it enters the combustion chamber. That translates directly into better combustion efficiency, more power from less fuel, fewer emissions. The original version displaced 170 cubic inches. That's about 2.8 liters. It made 101 horsepower, which by 1960 standards was pretty modest. But Chrysler wasn't done. Within a year, they bored it out to 225 cubic inches, 3.7 liters. And that's the engine that would become legendary. See, the 225 Slant Six wasn't designed to win drag races. It was designed to last. And the engineering decisions that went into it reflected that philosophy from the very beginning. Let's talk about the block. Most engines of that era used cast iron blocks, and the Slant Six was no exception. But Chrysler made theirs thick, really thick. The cylinder walls had extra material. The main bearing webs were reinforced. The entire bottom end was overbuilt for the power it was making. Now, you might think that's wasteful. Why use all that extra iron for an engine that only makes 145 horsepower? But that extra material served a purpose. It made the block incredibly rigid. Rigidity means less flex under load. Less flex means tighter tolerances. Tighter tolerances mean less wear over time. The crankshaft was another masterstroke. It was a 7-main bearing design, which was unusual for a 6-cylinder engine at the time. Most competitors used 4 or 5 main bearings. More bearings mean better support for the crank, less vibration, less stress on any single point. The Slant Six's crankshaft was essentially bulletproof, and then there was the head. The Slant Six used a wedge-shaped combustion chamber, which wasn't revolutionary by itself, but Chrysler's engineers optimized it for efficiency rather than peak power. The spark plug sat in a position that promoted complete combustion. The valves were arranged to maximize airflow without requiring exotic materials or tight clearances. Everything was designed to be simple, robust, and easy to service. I mention this because the Slant Six's design philosophy was fundamentally different from the V8 mentality that dominated American automotive thinking. The V8 guys were always chasing more displacement, more compression, more horsepower. They'd push their engines to the ragged edge of reliability, because that's what sold cars. The Slant Six engineers took the opposite approach. They asked, what if we build an engine that never breaks? The results spoke for themselves. By 1962, Slant Six powered Valiants were showing up at dealerships with owners reporting 50,000 miles, 60,000 miles, 80,000 miles without any major work. That was unheard of at the time. Most engines of that era were considered worn out by 70 or 80,000 miles. The Slant Six was just getting warmed up. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. The Slant Six wasn't just reliable because of good engineering, it was reliable because of smart engineering. There's a difference. Take the cooling system. The Slant Six used a cross-flow design that circulated coolant more efficiently than conventional setups. Hot spots that would have caused problems in other engines simply didn't develop. The thermostat housing was positioned to prevent air pockets from forming. Little details like that, invisible to the average owner, added up to an engine that ran cooler and lasted longer. The oiling system was similarly over-engineered, full-pressure lubrication to all the main and rod bearings, a high-capacity oil pump, generous oil galleries throughout the block. Some engineers thought Chrysler was being paranoid. They were right. And that paranoia paid dividends for decades. But the Slant Six's biggest advantage might have been its simplicity. Count the number of parts in a 225 Slant Six versus a contemporary V8. The Six has fewer pistons, fewer connecting rods, fewer valves, fewer push rods, fewer rocker arms. Fewer parts mean fewer things that can break. And when something did need service, the Slant Six's layout made it accessible. You could reach almost everything without removing other components. Shade tree mechanics loved it. If you've made it this far, you're probably into this kind of stuff. Quick question, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. And hey, subscribe if you haven't. We do this every week. All right, let's talk about what happened when real people got their hands on these engines, because that's where the legend really began. Throughout the 1960s, the Slant Six powered everything from economy compacts to work trucks. Taxi companies discovered that Slant Six-powered Darts and Valiants could run 200,000 miles with nothing more than oil changes and tune-ups. Police departments found the same thing: delivery fleets, rural mail carriers. Anyone who needed a vehicle that would start every morning and keep running, no matter what, gravitated toward the Slant Six. The stories started piling up. There was the guy in Minnesota who put 400,000 miles on his original engine before finally selling the car. Still running, by the way. There was the farmer in Nebraska who used a Slant Six Dodge pickup as his daily driver for 23 years, and only replaced the starter once. There was the traveling salesman who documented over 300,000 miles on his Valiant without ever pulling the head. Now, you might be thinking these are outliers, exceptional examples, and sure, some of them probably are. But when you hear the same story over and over from different parts of the country, from different types of owners, you start to realize something. The Slant Six wasn't just occasionally reliable, it was systematically, predictably, boringly reliable. And boring was exactly the problem, because while the Slant Six was quietly racking up mileage records, the American car-buying public was obsessed with something else entirely. They wanted muscle. The 1960s were the era of the horsepower wars. Every year, the Big Three rolled out bigger engines with wilder claims. The 426 Hemi, the 446 pack, the 427. These were the engines that got magazine covers and TV commercials. They were the engines that young men dreamed about. The Slant Six, by comparison, was what your grandmother drove. This created a strange situation for Chrysler. They had one of the best engines ever designed, and almost nobody cared. The performance guys dismissed it as an economy motor. The economy buyers appreciated it but didn't talk about it. The Slant Six existed in a marketing dead zone, too good to be exciting and too boring to be celebrated. But here's the thing about engineering excellence. It doesn't need marketing. It proves itself through performance. And as the years went by, the Slant Six's reputation grew through word of mouth. Mechanics started noticing. When you see enough V8s come in with blown head gaskets and worn-out bottom ends, you start to appreciate the engine that never shows up on the lift. The Slant Six became known as the engine you couldn't kill. Owners tried. They ran them low on oil. They overheated them. They beat on them mercilessly. And the engines just kept running. There's a famous story about a Slant Six torture test. Some enthusiasts decided to see exactly how much abuse the engine could take. They drained the oil and ran it at highway speed. It took over an hour before the engine finally seized. An hour, with no oil. Most engines would have been dead in minutes. The Slant Six's robust construction and generous bearing clearances kept it alive long past any reasonable expectation. That kind of durability wasn't an accident. It was the direct result of every conservative design decision those engineers made back in 1959. The thick block walls, the 7-main bearing crank, the simple, accessible layout, all of it contributed to an engine that could tolerate conditions far beyond its design parameters. By the early 1970s, the Slant Six had evolved into something even better. Chrysler introduced electronic ignition in 1972, years before most competitors. That meant no more points to adjust, no more condensers to replace. The engine became even more maintenance-free. Compression ratios dropped slightly to accommodate unleaded gasoline, but reliability actually improved because the engines weren't working as hard. The 1970s also brought new applications for the Slant Six. Chrysler used it in their full-size vans, where it provided adequate power with excellent fuel economy. They used it in the new F-body pickups. They even offered it as an option in some of their larger cars for buyers who prioritized economy over performance. And then something interesting happened. The muscle car era ended, almost overnight. The oil embargo of 1973 changed everything. Suddenly, gas went from 30 cents a gallon to over $1. Suddenly, those 440s and 426s that everybody lusted after became financial liabilities. Suddenly, fuel economy mattered more than quarter-mile times, and suddenly, the Slant Six looked pretty smart. Chrysler had been building efficient six-cylinder engines for over a decade, while their competitors scrambled to develop small engines that could actually survive regular use. Ford's inline sixes were decent, but not exceptional. GM's sixes had various issues depending on the year. The Slant Six had 13 years of refinement and a reputation that no marketing campaign could match. Throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s, the Slant Six remained a cornerstone of Chrysler's lineup. It powered the Aspen and Volare. It powered the M-body Diplomat and Grand Fury that became ubiquitous police cars. It powered countless work trucks and commercial vehicles. The engine was so trusted that fleet buyers specifically requested it. By this point, the Slant Six had been in production for over 2 decades. Think about that. In an industry that typically replaced engines every 5 to 7 years, Chrysler's little tilted six kept going and going. They refined it, certainly, improved the emissions equipment, updated the accessory drives, but the fundamental architecture remained unchanged because there was no need to change it. The Slant Six's longevity also meant that parts became incredibly common and cheap. Junkyards were full of them. Rebuilders kept extensive inventories. Amateur mechanics could find everything they needed at any auto parts store. This created a virtuous cycle where the engine's popularity made them easier and cheaper to maintain, which made them more popular, which made them even easier to maintain. Compare this to the V8 landscape. By the 1980s, many of those legendary muscle car engines were becoming expensive to maintain. Parts were getting scarce. Specialists charged premium rates. The glory days of cheap performance were over. Meanwhile, Slant Six owners were still buying pistons and bearings off the shelf for a fraction of the cost. Now, I want to be fair here. The Slant Six wasn't perfect. It wasn't even close to the fastest engine Chrysler made. The 225 topped out around 145 horsepower in its most potent form, which was barely adequate for larger vehicles. It could feel sluggish in heavy traffic. Passing power on the highway required planning. If you wanted excitement, you had to look elsewhere. The engine also had some known issues. The exhaust manifold was notorious for cracking, especially on engines that saw a lot of cold starts. The heat riser valve would stick. Some years had problems with the harmonic balancer. These weren't fatal flaws, but they were annoyances that dedicated owners learned to address. But here's where perspective matters. Those issues were minor compared to what V8 owners dealt with. A cracked exhaust manifold is an afternoon repair. A spun bearing in a big block is a rebuild. The Slant Six's problems were inconveniences. The V8's problems were catastrophes. And the numbers don't lie. Look at any survey of long-distance original engines from that era. The Slant Six shows up disproportionately. Ask any mechanic who worked through the 1970s and 1980s which engine they saw with the highest mileage. The answer is almost always the same. The Slant Six earned its reputation 1 mile at a time. The engine finally went out of production in 1987, 27 years. That's an extraordinary run for any automotive component, especially one that was essentially unchanged from its original design. Chrysler replaced it with a modern overhead cam 4-cylinder that was more fuel efficient but far less durable. Some would say that was progress. Others would call it a step backward. What happened to all those Slant Six engines? Many of them are still running. Visit any Mopar enthusiast gathering and you'll see them. Lovingly restored Valiants and Darts, work trucks that have been in the same family for generations, police cars retired from service but still perfectly functional. The Slant Six community remains active and passionate because the engines themselves refuse to give up. And what of Willem Weertman, the engineer who started it all? He continued working at Chrysler for decades, eventually becoming one of the company's most respected powertrain engineers. He received multiple patents and industry awards, but when asked about his legacy, he always came back to the Slant Six. It was the engine that proved his philosophy. That balanced engineering beat brute force. That reliability mattered more than peak performance. That building something right the first time was better than building something exciting that fell apart. The Slant Six outlived the muscle car era. It outlived the malaise era. It outlived most of its competitors. And in a sense, it outlived the very philosophy that created it, because modern automotive engineering has largely abandoned the robust simplicity that made the Slant Six great. Today's engines are marvels of efficiency and power, but they're also complex, difficult to service, and often designed with planned obsolescence in mind. Maybe that's why the Slant Six still resonates with people. It represents a different approach to engineering, an approach that prioritized the customer's long-term interests over quarterly sales figures. An approach that asked not, what's the minimum we can get away with, But what's the most reliable thing we can build? 300,000 miles. That was the Slant Six's implicit promise, and it delivered on that promise over and over again, not through exotic materials or advanced technology, but through thoughtful design and conservative engineering. The V8s got the glory. The Slant Six got the mileage. And that is the story of the Chrysler 225 Slant Six. Subscribe if you want more, and let me know in the comments, have you ever owned one of these, or know someone who did? Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.